The day my son-in-law stood up in front of my crew and called me a liability to my own company, I did something that surprised even me. I poured myself another coffee, pulled out a chair, and sat down. I want to tell you about that moment. Not because I came out looking like some kind of hero. I'm not sure I did, honestly, but because of what happened to the 37 men and women who showed up to work that morning, not knowing their jobs were about to be put on a table for someone else to decide. That part I can't let go of, even now. My name is not important for this story. What matters is what I built and how long it took me, and what I was willing to do when someone who married into my family tried to dismantle it in a single Tuesday morning meeting. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. If you know the place, you already understand something about me. If you don't, it's a mining town, or it used to be, and the people there don't waste words. My father worked at the smelter for 31 years. My mother kept the books for a hardware store on Elm Street until her hands gave out. I watched both of them work themselves past the point of comfort, and never once heard either of them complain about it in a way that asked for sympathy. They complained the way working people do, matter-of-factly, over dinner, and then they moved on. I started my company 22 years ago with a used pickup truck, a set of tools I bought at an estate sale in Garson, and a contract to replace the eave screws on a 40-unit rental complex in Chelmsford. I did the job myself. Took me 3 weeks. The property manager paid me on a Friday afternoon and shook my hand and said, "You do good work." That was it. No celebration. I drove home, transferred the money into my account, ate leftover chili, and started calling around for the next job. That was how it went for a long time. By the time my daughter brought her husband home to meet me, the company was running 11 crews across northern Ontario. Residential roofing, commercial flat roofing, insulation, eave screws. We'd expanded steadily. The kind of expansion that doesn't make headlines, but fills your order book every spring and keeps your people employed through the winter when the work gets thin. We had a pension plan. We had a health benefits package that I'd fought to put in place, because I remembered what it felt like to break a finger on a job site and have to decide whether to go to the clinic or finish the shift. 37 full-time employees, a handful more who came on seasonal. A payroll I personally reviewed every 2 weeks because I wanted to know the numbers, and I wanted to know the names attached to them. My son-in-law's name is Callum. He came from money, not inherited money but new money, the kind that comes quickly and without much friction, the kind that makes a certain type of person believe they have a talent for business, when really they have a talent for timing. He had an MBA from a school in Toronto. He wore expensive jackets to casual dinners. He talked about efficiencies and scalability, the way some people talk about the weather, constantly and without much precision. I didn't dislike him when my daughter first brought him home. That's important for me to say, because what happened later could make it seem like I'd had a problem with him from the beginning, and that's not true. He was charming, in the way that people who grow up with money often are. He knew how to fill a room. He asked questions and appeared to listen to the answers. My daughter looked at him the way you hope your child looks at the person they've chosen, and for a while that was enough for me. The friction started slowly. At family dinners, he would ask about the business. How many crews, what margins, what was the plan for growth? And when I answered, I could see him making adjustments in his head, small recalculations, the way someone does when they think the numbers should be different. He never came right out and said I was doing it wrong. He was too smart for that. But he had a way of saying interesting that was not actually a compliment. After the wedding, he started dropping into the office occasionally. My office manager, a woman named Lorraine, who has been with me for 14 years and knows every contract we've ever signed, told me after his third visit that he'd been asking her questions about our vendor relationships and our insurance deductibles. She wasn't sure how to handle it. I told her to answer what she was comfortable answering and refer anything else to me. I should have said something to my daughter then. I didn't. I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself he was trying to connect with me on my own terms. There is a particular kind of patience that comes from spending your life in the trades. You learn that most problems, if you leave them alone long enough, reveal what they actually are. I was waiting. He revealed what he actually was on a Tuesday morning in April. He had asked, through my daughter, if he could come in to give the management team a presentation. He framed it as a favor. Some ideas he'd been working on, a fresh set of eyes, no pressure. My daughter mentioned it over the phone one Sunday night, and I could tell from the way she said it that she'd already agreed on my behalf. So I said fine, set it up, and I called my site supervisor and my operations manager and my office manager and told them we'd be in a meeting Tuesday morning and to have coffee ready. I did not cancel my own morning. I had a call at 7 with a supplier in Timmins about shingle pricing, and I took it from my truck in the parking lot before I came in. I was wearing the same thing I always wear to the office: work pants, a fleece vest, steel-toed boots. I hadn't shaved in 3 days. I had a thermos of coffee that my wife had made before I left the house. When I walked into the boardroom, and I'll be honest, calling it a boardroom is generous. It's a room with a long table and chairs and a whiteboard we use for scheduling. My son-in-law was already there with a laptop and a projector and a printed deck that he'd clearly had prepared by someone else, because it was too polished for something he'd done at home. He looked up when I came in, and there was a fraction of a second where something passed across his face. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. Mild surprise, maybe. Maybe he'd expected me to be dressed differently. He didn't say anything about it. He started the presentation. For the first 10 minutes, I'll give him this. It was professionally done. He'd pulled our public filings, looked at comparable companies in the sector, identified what he called structural inefficiencies in our labor model. He used a lot of terms. Lorraine was writing things down. My operations manager, a man named Pete who has been running crews since before my son-in-law was in high school, sat with his arms crossed and his face perfectly neutral in the way that Pete does when he is deciding whether something is worth his energy. Then Callum got to slide 14. I know it was slide 14 because he said slide 14 out loud before he clicked to it, which struck me as an unusual thing to say. Slide 14 was a restructuring proposal. It recommended reducing our full-time workforce from 37 to 22. The remaining 15 positions would be converted to flexible contract arrangements, which is a phrase that, in the trades, means you let people go and bring them back with no benefits and no guaranteed hours and no pension contributions. He walked through it methodically. Cost savings projected at approximately $280,000 annually, improved EBITDA margin, better positioning for a potential sale or external investment in years 3 to 5. Nobody said anything for a moment. Pete looked at me. Lorraine looked at me. My estimator, a young guy named Brent who has been with us for 3 years, and who I know is saving up for a house in Hanmer, looked at me. I looked at my coffee. The labor costs, my son-in-law continued, are the primary drag on margin. And I think part of the issue is that the hiring philosophy here has been, with respect, a little too. He paused, and the pause was the worst part, the kind of pause that lets you know the person has rehearsed what comes next. Sentimental. He looked at me when he said it. He meant it for me. We both knew it. I took a sip of my coffee. You've built something real here, he said, and the tone shifted slightly. Softer, like he was about to give me a gift. But the model you're running is 20 years old. The market has changed. The margins are there if you're willing to make some hard decisions. I know this isn't comfortable, but... And he smiled, the kind of smile that is calibrated to seem kind while delivering something unkind. The kind of person who built this company from scratch, working at the ground level, is not necessarily the same kind of person who should be running it at this stage. No offense. Lorraine stopped writing. Pete uncrossed his arms. Brent looked at the table. I said, "None taken." And I meant it genuinely in the way that you mean something when you are setting it aside to deal with at the right moment, rather than the current one. He finished the presentation. He clicked through the last few slides. Implementation timeline, suggested external HR consultants, projected 12-month transition plan. When he closed the laptop, he looked at me with the expression of someone who has just done you a favor and is waiting to be thanked for it. "I appreciate you putting this together," I said. "I can walk you through the financials in more detail if you want," he said. "I know numbers aren't always the most natural." "I understand the numbers," I said. A small silence. "Before we talk about next steps," I said, "I want to make sure everyone in this room is clear on one thing. Can you pull up slide 14 again?" He opened the laptop. Slide 14 came back up. "The 15 positions you're proposing to eliminate," I said. "Walk me through the rationale on the pension impact." He did. He talked about the reduction in defined contribution obligations, the savings on employer-matched RRSPs, the lowered CPP and EI premium exposure on contract workers versus full-time employees. "Right," I said. And under the current corporate structure, do you know who has authorization to approve a workforce reduction of that scale? He looked at me. I'd assume that goes to senior management. You, presumably. It goes to the voting shareholders, I said. Per the shareholder agreement, any restructuring that affects more than 20% of the full-time workforce requires approval from shareholders holding a combined 60% of voting interest. Are you familiar with who holds those shares? He wasn't. I could see it in his face, the recalibration, the searching behind his eyes. I hold 73% of the voting shares, I said. My wife holds the remaining 27. There are no other shareholders. There is no board. There is no investment committee. There is me, and there is my wife, and what you've presented this morning is something that would require our joint approval, which means it would require her to agree, which means you would have had to have that conversation with her before you walked in here this morning, which I'm guessing you didn't. The room was very quiet. The payroll you want to cut, I said. I sign it. Every 2 weeks, from an account in my name. The vendor contracts you want to renegotiate. I have personal relationships with most of those people going back 15 years. The insurance deductibles you mentioned to Lorraine last month. I set those deductibles. I've been setting them since before you graduated from high school. I wasn't raising my voice. I want you to understand that. There was nothing dramatic about the way I said any of it. I was using the same voice I use when I'm talking to a supplier about shingle prices or explaining a warranty clause to a homeowner. Even, direct, because the facts didn't need any help. I built this company on my own, I said. I did it without investors and without a board and without a management consultant. And the reason there are 37 people on that payroll is because I made decisions every single year to grow slowly enough to protect the people who were already here. That wasn't sentiment. That was strategy. Because in this business, your reputation is your crew, and your crew is your reputation, and anyone who spent real time in the trades knows that. My son-in-law had not moved. He was sitting very still in the way that people sit when they are trying to decide what to do next, and none of the options are good. Now, I said, is there anything else on the agenda, or are we done? Pete looked at the ceiling. I think he was trying not to smile. Lorraine had stopped pretending to take notes. Brent was looking at his hands, but the tension had gone out of his shoulders. My son-in-law closed his laptop. He said, I didn't realize the structure was... You didn't ask, I said. That's the thing, isn't it? You made assumptions about what I was, and you didn't ask. He didn't say anything else. I thanked everyone for coming in. I told Pete I'd be over to the Lively job site after lunch to look at the flashing issue on Unit 4. I told Lorraine I needed the Timmins contract renewal on my desk by Thursday. I told Brent his estimate on the Azilda flat roof looked solid and to go ahead and send it. Then I stood up, picked up my thermos and walked out. I drove to the job site. I walked the perimeter of the building with Pete, who has a way of talking about roofing that could make it sound like philosophy if you're in the right mood. We looked at the flashing. We talked about the ice damming issue from the winter. We ate lunch in the truck. Sandwiches from the Tim Hortons on Falconbridge Road. And Pete said, at some point, without looking at me, he'll figure it out or he won't. That was all he said about it, and that was enough. I don't know exactly what happened at my daughter's house that evening. She called me around 8 o'clock. Her voice was careful in the way that a person's voice gets when they are managing 2 conversations at once, the one they're having with you and the one they're having internally. She said, Dad, I didn't know he was going to present it that way. I said, I know. He told me it was just ideas, just something to think about. I know. Are you angry? I thought about that for a moment. I was sitting in my chair in the living room, my wife across from me with a book, the TV on low in the corner, the particular kind of quiet that builds up in a house after 30 years of living in it together. No, I said, I'm not angry, and I meant it. Not because what he'd done was acceptable. Proposing to eliminate 15 people's livelihoods in front of their coworkers, without talking to me first, calling my philosophy sentimental, implying I didn't belong in my own company. None of that was acceptable. But anger is a fire that burns what you put near it without distinguishing, and I wasn't interested in burning anything down. I'm going to need him to understand something, I said to my daughter. He doesn't have to like the way I run things, but he needs to understand that this company is not an asset for him to optimize. It's a place where people come to work and go home to their families. Some of those families have been depending on us for a long time. My daughter was quiet, And if he wants to build something, I said, he should build it himself. That's the only way to understand what it costs. She said she'd talk to him. I said good night. My wife looked up from her book and asked if everything was all right, and I said yes, and it was mostly true. What I didn't tell my daughter was what had been going through my head during that meeting. Not anger, not even surprise particularly. What I'd been thinking about while my son-in-law clicked through his slides and talked about margins and flexible labor models was a man named Terry Lapointe, who has been running my Eavesdrew crew since 2014. Terry has a daughter with a disability that requires specialized equipment and ongoing therapy. The benefits package we carry costs me more than a leaner company would accept, and I accepted it years ago specifically because of situations like Terry's. Terry has never asked me about that. We've never discussed it. He comes to work, he does excellent work, he goes home. I was thinking about Terry on slide 14, and I was thinking about a woman named Bev Arsenault who runs my administrative support and who came back to work for me after a difficult divorce when her kids were small, and who I know, from things Lorraine has mentioned over the years, had been turned down for work elsewhere because she'd been out of the workforce for 6 years. She's been with us for 11 years. She's the most organized person I have ever met. These are not sentimental choices. They are choices made by someone who has spent 22 years understanding that a business is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is a collection of decisions about people, made one at a time, over a long time, and the decisions accumulate into something either worth building or not worth building. I had decided a long time ago what kind of thing I wanted to build. My son-in-law had looked at that thing and seen inefficiency. That told me something about him that no presentation could have told me any faster. A few weeks went by. He didn't come to the office again. My daughter and I spoke on the phone the way we always do, once or twice a week, and she didn't bring it up and I didn't bring it up. There was a kind of parallel life happening alongside the regular one, and I let it run. Then one evening she called me and she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "He told me you embarrassed him in front of your employees." I took a breath. I didn't introduce him to the room as my son-in-law, I said. I didn't tell anyone who he was before the meeting. I didn't say anything about him during the meeting that wasn't a statement of fact about the company structure. If he was embarrassed, it was because he walked into a room he didn't understand and made claims he hadn't verified. She was quiet for a long time. "Is he right that you were too quiet?" she finally asked. Like, should you have told him more? Before it got to that, and I thought about that seriously, because it was a fair question and she deserved a fair answer. "Maybe," I said, "but here's the thing. He had access to ask. He came to the office 3 times. He asked Lorraine about our insurance deductibles. He put together a 40-slide deck with our financial projections. He did all of that research, and at no point did he ask me directly what my ownership structure was. He didn't ask because he assumed he already knew the answer, and the answer he assumed, that I was some kind of figurehead who could be guided out of the way, that assumption came from somewhere, and it didn't come from anything I said to him." Another long pause. "I know," she said quietly. "I want things to be good," I said. "Between all of us. That's what I want. But that requires him to be honest about what happened and why, and I don't think we're quite there yet." She said she understood. I believed her. I don't know what the future looks like for my daughter's marriage. That's not mine to decide, and it's not mine to predict. What I know is that she is a smart woman who was raised to understand the difference between someone who asks questions and someone who makes assumptions, and I have to trust that she is watching the same things I'm watching. What I know for certain is that on the day my son-in-law walked into my boardroom with a plan to dismantle what I had spent 22 years building, 37 people drove to work, without knowing their jobs were on a slide. They parked their trucks, they put on their harnesses, they did what they came to do, and they went home that evening the same way they came in, employed, insured, with a pension contribution, waiting in an account that they'd earned. That's the thing he called sentimental. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I don't think I'd change a single word of what I said in that room. Not because I wanted to humiliate him. I didn't. Not because I wanted to win. Winning wasn't the point. The point was that 37 people's lives don't become a line item just because someone with an MBA and a nice jacket decides they should be. Not in my company. Not while I'm signing the checks. My father worked at the smelter for 31 years. He came home smelling like the work, and he sat at the table, and he ate dinner, and he was tired in the way that people are tired when they have given the day everything it asked for. I don't know if he ever felt respected by the people who ran the plant. I don't know if he ever thought about it in those terms. I thought about it. I thought about it when I was buying tools at an estate sale in Garson and trying to figure out if I could make the math work. I thought about it every time I made a hiring decision that a leaner operation wouldn't have made. I thought about it on slide 14 of a presentation I hadn't asked for, in a room that had my name on the door, sitting across from someone who had decided, without asking, that I was the wrong kind of person to be running my own company. I took a sip of my coffee, and I let him finish.